Okay, so something else we want to do is in this class is going to be to dispel stereotypes of natives. And it's amazing how powerful these are. One of the more powerful native stereotypes is that they were one with the land. And so this is actually an image from a theme park that is just a caricature of what natives, of who they were, what they did, and how they lived. There's some truth to some of the stuff in this display, so that they used kayaks is technically true. That some of them lived in teepees is technically true, and that they would have utilized the river for resources, that's technically true. But then this is kind of a Disney-fied, just grossly incorrect image of natives. And so that's one thing we want to dispel, that they were somehow less than advanced. In a lot of ways, they were more advanced than the Europeans who encountered them in the early modern period, in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s. The natives could do things that the Europeans could not. They just didn't have certain aspects of technology. So condescending to natives by saying, well, they didn't have this or that technology, is like condescending to people of our recent past because they didn't have smartphones. Arguably, they were better off for that than we are. So that's kind of one of the myths we want to dispel, is that natives were somehow less than evolved or less than advanced than the Europeans that they encountered, and that they all kind of lived in this oneness with nature. Another myth that we want to dispel is that natives were wild and savage. They most definitely were not. They were civilized. They adapted their lifestyles based on the environments that they lived in and the resources available to them and their level of technology. But a lot of natives were actually quite sophisticated, and even by our standards today, and they were certainly not savages. That's just ridiculous, and it's a condescension to say, oh, they were wild, like some kind of Tarzan or something. They weren't like that. Another myth to dispel is that they were warlike, more warlike than usual, because they were wild and savage, and that's also a myth. Obviously, they had wars, but not much more often, and arguably less often than Europeans and people in the Western and Eastern worlds had wars. And the wars they fought were actually less brutal than the wars Europeans fought, and they became more brutal as they encountered Europeans in an effort to defend themselves. And even in a lot of those cases, whatever they did didn't even come close to matching what was done to them. So that's another myth we want to dispel, is that they were naturally warlike. They were not. Generally, they were less warlike than Europeans. They fought less frequent wars than Europeans did. And another stereotype is that they were aggressive and a threat to what your book's going to call colonial settler ranger settlement. Generally speaking, Native Americans were not a threat to United States creation and development. And the idea that they were, like, you had to circle the wagons here to protect against Native American attack, that was much more of a irrational fear that a lot of Americans had in the 19th century, and not really reality. About 500 people total died in Native American attacks against civilians on the Overland Trail, for example. And so for the 20 years that the Overland Trail was in operation, what we know of as the Oregon Trail, 500 people out of the tens of thousands, something like 100 and some thousand people that traveled across that trail, 500 of them were killed in Native American attacks. So many, many, many more died of disease, which was the actual killer on the Overland Trail. So that's another stereotype, is that natives were somehow a threat to settlement. That was a very powerful stereotype in the 19th, 20th centuries, that natives were not conducive to modernism, that they were a dead and dying people because they were so backward, and that's definitely not true. Another myth is that they were savages, but there was something noble about being savage. And this was kind of perpetrated by all the images we have of them, especially from the 19th and early 20th century. Basically, the idea of the noble savage is that by being less advanced, there is something more virtuous about them. They're not corrupted by technology. They're more simple, but more wholesome people. And so this was kind of the 19th century good guy view of natives. It's still condescending. It's still arguing that they're not at the same level of development or civilization or education or anything. But it's saying, oh, well, they're more noble because of that. We're all corrupted by technology, and we're so advanced technologically. Westerners are so advanced technologically, but natives are not, and that actually makes them more noble. And that's also kind of a backhanded compliment. And so this is something else we want to avoid. You see the noble savage trope a lot. If you've ever seen the movie Avatar, it's a great example of noble savage trope in fiction. So this was a very popular fictional trope. If a kid, you ever read the poem Hiawatha, similar kind of idea. There's this nobility in being simple, but the natives were not simple. That's just a way that Westerners condescended to them in their literary tropes. So the themes of the course we're going to come back to a lot during this whole course. We're going to be looking at the context of natives within national, meaning the United States, development and international development. So we'll look at how natives interacted with the world that was going on around them at the time. A big theme is going to be native defense of their homelands and defense of their own autonomy. That's going to be a recurring theme throughout the entire course, is that a lot of what natives did after contact with Westerners, with Europeans, was defending their homelands and then trying to defend their individuality and their tribal uniqueness and their tribal culture and their autonomy, trying not to be forced to become what they were not. Those identities, however, that they had did shift. And so what natives became across the centuries was different from what they were. And that was a necessity of the massive changes happening worldwide. Technology would change, natives would change. Geopolitics would change in Europe, natives would change. So they were affected by the world around them just like we are. And their identities shifted. And so some native communities changed into something that they had not ever been. And we're going to talk about those kinds of shifts. Another shift, or another factor we'll talk about a lot, is persistence of native culture. How strongly natives hold on to certain aspects of their culture, and how that persisted over time. We'll look at that. Distinctive views of family and gender. Americans have very westernized views of family and gender that natives did not have all that baggage. And we'll talk about that. Diversity. This is a big theme. When I say native, I'm referring to literally thousands of different kinds of people who don't have that much in common other than being part of the indigenous population. So Native Americans are very diverse. There's hundreds of official Native nations and then thousands of different groups within those. So, and that's just North America. We don't talk much about South America in this class. So the communities are very diverse, and while we'll be doing a lot of kind of bundling together for the purposes of the material in the class, we need to always remember it's an extremely diverse group. And then agency. is the last theme that I'll be talking about a lot throughout the course. Agency, meaning how natives shaped their own patterns of accommodation, adaptation, resistance, and revitalization, like how they made their own lives into what they are, not necessarily just what all was done to them. So you should have done this exercise on the content discussion. I'll be interested to see your responses to that. So this is a painting called the First Thanksgiving, and I want you to consider whether or not this is a useful resource to understand the relationship between the Wampanoag Indians and the Pilgrim settlers in 1621. And I was not the one who wrote that quote, since this is an exercise that comes from another book. I would not have said Wampanoag Indians. I would just said Wampanoag. And do you agree or disagree? And briefly support your answer. So I'll look forward to your responses on that content discussion. And this you should have done on your attendance exercise, and I'm grateful for those of you that responded to that. So if you have any questions for me about anything so far, feel free to email me or put a question in the discussion board. A lot of you have asked me how do I reply to the various discussion boards. So only on for most of the discussion boards that I create, I'll post a thread, and then you reply to that thread. You click on that, and then you click reply, and you leave a reply to that particular thread. And then you can also reply to your other students if you want. But you can't create new threads in most of those. Where you can create new threads is in the any questions discussion board, and then I'll reply to those. So if you have any questions for me, go ahead and ask, or feel free. Don't feel bad about any questions. I'll try my best to answer them, and you shouldn't feel embarrassed or inhibited for asking anything. I'm not going to judge you. That's not how we roll here. So thanks again for your time, and we'll see you in the first unit.